today we have Campbell Will back with us again. This is so exciting. This is actually a part two. We had such an amazing conversation the first time that we are continuing a second time, but let me introduce him again. He has such an amazing background. He has the unique combination of not only being a level 2 Wim Hof instructor, but also a senior physiotherapist. Additionally, he holds a heart math certification and is a renowned breathwork facilitator, helping his patients by improving their physical and mental well-being through his techniques. Please visit Campbell on his website at breathbodytherapy.com to see how he can help you with his high level of expertise in an admirable number of areas. Hi, Campbell. So happy to have you back.
It's always a pleasure, AJ. I'm really excited.
Amazing, amazing. Well, we talked about so many amazing things last time. I think something that we were beginning to open the door on, which I always find really fascinating, is using breath work to help with acute stress and also chronic and long-term stress. And you brought up the point that you work with you've worked with a lot of really stressed out CEOs who need the motivation they need like some hardcore data that they are improving their stress levels in the short term and also the long term, but I think many of them need that like short term feedback that they actually are improving their stress levels. So like, what are some of the things that you do to improve, like a little magic trick that because we all know that really, what is benefiting us the most, the things that we, like erosion on stone, the things that we perform for long periods of time, several times a week, that consistency. But some people just don't have the patience for that. And for some who need to be converted into believers of breath work, what are some of the things you would just throw at someone to try to make them a believer by the end of a session? If they're, for example, I'm a stressed out CEO and I don't really believe in breath work, but I want to be converted because I want something that's natural and great for me to be healing.
Yeah. Well, I always just find, experience is the greatest educator. And some people are really looking for observable, objective metrics. And things like HRV will indicate that. But as you said, there's kind of a lagging indicator there. We can bring it down in a session. They'll say, wow, my heart rate is slower or my HRV is higher. But that, again, is kind of like a data point that what they're really looking for is I want to feel less stressed, right? Even in the language, like I feel stressed. It's something going on somatically or cognitively or mentally that's like, I'm not firing on all cylinders, I'm a little bit distracted or I can't concentrate. And so I always just, whenever I get met with that little bit of doubt, I'm like, let's just do it. You tell me if it works. I don't need to convince you with the data. I need you to be like, something shifted in me. And so I'll usually jump straight into like a shorter practice, something like Tumo breathing, like a condensed version of the Wim Hof method, because it has this ability to kind of flip the toggle between sympathetic, parasympathetic, alert and calm. And so we do that a couple of times and, 10 people out of 10 are usually like, yeah, I noticed something, I feel a bit stiller or more present or my mind's not racing. And we can do that in the space of 1, maybe 2 minutes, right? And I think what a lot of people perceive is like, oh, you're going to tell me to sit down and do breathing for 20 or 30 minutes. I don't have time for that. No one does, especially in that sphere. So if I can say, let's do this for 1 minute and you tell me how you feel. Do you feel different? And most people are, yeah, I do feel different. So, all right, if we do that for twice as long or 3 times as long or 5 times as long, there's going to be an exponentially kind of more impactful experience for you. And I think that's what a lot of those particular type of people need. It's like short and sweet, effective, doesn't require a lot of any equipment. It doesn't require me to remove myself from a certain situation. It's just like, bang, I can play with this knob and dial on my nervous system. And then I'm into a different state of alertness and kind of mental acuity.
Absolutely. And I love that you bring up Tumo and Wim Hof. And, for those of the listeners who don't know the difference between the two, or if one is inspired by the other, could you describe what the differences between Tumo and Wim Hof are?
Yeah, so I'll even take it one step further back. So both of these would fall into a category of cyclical hyperventilation, right? We're doing a period of over breathing or super breathing or deep breathing, and then a period of no breathing at all. And so Tumo is a form of Tibetan breathwork, and it's been around for probably 3,000 to 5,000 years. And I would almost argue, and this is from Wim's words himself, that's kind of the basis. And that's one of the tools that he kind of studied and then brought the Wim Hof method into this kind of popularized framework we see today. So Tumo is has a lot more components of imagery, mental visualization, which the Wim Hof method doesn't, which makes the Wim Hof method way more accessible. You know, if you look into the text on Tumo, it's like a 10-stage visualization, you know, so usually that was reserved to the people that have been in the monastery a really long time and they've cultivated that ability, and then they're adding in breathing to a visual component of an exercise. Whereas the Wim Hof method's kind of like, we don't need the visualization, let's just breathe. You know, so we see more breathing. So Tumo's typically 5 to 10 breaths, really active breaths, short breath hold at the top, release the exhale, and then pausing at the bottom, maybe 10 or 15 seconds. So these short little cycles. Whereas the Wim Hof method is like 30 or 40 breaths, hold for a minute and a half, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, you know, a maximum retention, inhale, recovery, and that would be one cycle. So we get a lot more of the breathing component, but we're not using this kind of complex visualization.
Very interesting. And would you say that both of the methods of hyperventilation in conjunction with some breath retentions contribute to higher temperatures in the body? I mean, especially in the core. Would Tumo and Wim Hof both contribute to that? And what are the mechanisms behind the creation of that increased heat in the body?
Yeah, so it's super interesting, you know, when we look back at, so Tumo, these stories kind of came out of the East and came to the West, I think in about the 50s and 60s, of these monks that could control their body temperature. And I think it was either Harvard or Stanford, one of the big universities, actually sent some researchers across to kind of debunk this myth. You know, like, that's not possible. Let's go and check that out with our objective kind of measurements. And they found, holy shit, like they can. You know, so these monks can sit there and they could increase their body temperature 15, 20 degrees at will. You know, they're not running on the spot or doing push-ups. They're sitting there breathing and meditating. And so the interesting component is they actually studied these, you know, Tibetan monks, and they would do just the visual component. They would get them to do just the breathing, and then they would do both. And it was the both that obviously had the most profound effect, but a lot of them could actually regulate body temperature through visualization without the breathing. And so it goes to kind of open this door as to the power that the mind has over the body. And, you know, we read about people like Swami Rama, who was kind of this really profound yogi, like grew up practicing yoga from like a 2-year-old. And he can sit there without moving and he can make his heart rate go up to 120 beats a minute and then down to 20 beats a minute. And he can change the temperature in just half of his hand, right? They put him in a thermal scanner and he heats up this one half of the hand and he keeps the other. Like, so just a profound sense of control over the body. But both of those practices, whether it is a direction of mind as well as shifting autonomic nervous system, have this seemingly, you know, autonomic ability to regulate body temperature.
It's really, really outstanding. And, you know, you think about, of course, I think about just the benefits of simply heating the body, you know, especially for those who can't perform cardiovascular or strength exercise in a normal way because maybe they've had previous injury. And so they expose themselves to something like long-term sauna use or some kind of heat, because we know that long-term sauna use, for example, can improve cardiovascular endurance and can keep a person pretty, you know, in their circulatory system, in their cardiovascular system, pretty darn healthy just by exposing themselves to heat. So now, as you're saying this, I'm thinking, wow, the increased heat in the body and getting the heart rate up to 120 beats per minute just with breath work, can we maintain our cardiovascular function and maybe at even a moderate level of cardiovascular fitness by just performing this breath work that's exposing our body to heat and also elevated heart rates? You know, I think that's so fascinating.
I mean, I love that thread to pull on because, you know, unfortunately for a lot of, I'm seeing quite a lot of people with long COVID right now, and they've gone from like running triathlons and training for marathons to I walk 30 meters and my heart rate spikes to 140. You know, this autonomic dysregulation, this cardiovascular, and I can't get that person to go for a run, right? They just don't have the exercise tolerance, but I can get them to breathe. And we can do protocols that are going to elevate heart rate and then to reduce heart rate. So it's like we bring back in this beautiful idea of stress response. You know, add the stress, breathing, fast or deep or active holds, right? And we kind of stimulate the response of my heart rate's going up in a controlled way. And then I bring myself back down and we start to re-engage that system that we all take for granted, right? I run up a set of stairs, my heart starts to pump harder, I breathe harder to deliver oxygen and remove waste. That system can get a little bit out of whack when we go from doing lots to doing none. And so breathing becomes this really nice in-between. It's like you don't have the exercise tolerance or capacity, but we do need to stimulate your heart, you know?
Absolutely. I think it's so, you know, I also think it's really interesting, you know, for those, you know, to your point, long COVID, where, I'm also experiencing this quite a bit, here in New York City, all over the world. This is a worldwide issue, and we're going to be dealing with this for years. And I think that, having a protocol that can decrease a person's anxiety and regulate their autonomic nervous system so that they feel better about exercising, and starting with a breathwork protocol that can condition their cardiovascular system and, keep their body healthy until they're ready, like you said, to go for a run, it's so brilliant. And it's such a great, I think that a person should always have breathwork in their program, whether they're at their maximum, capacity of health, or they're, dealing with something like long COVID, but using it as an intermediary or a transition to get a person, through this period of time where their autonomic nervous system is so dysregulated. It's scary because it also puts a person into a state of anxiety, when the heart rate does get up to 140 beats per minute, when, going for a walk, it probably was at 105 beats per minute, maybe, and I think teaching a person to also breathe during integrate the breath work that you're teaching them within their exercise routine as they gradually add intensity is also really important, especially for the person who is autonomically dysregulated, So like, how do you integrate your breathwork protocols into the person's exercise routine once they've gone through a static breathwork protocol? Or do you do static and dynamic breathwork protocols? How do you integrate the two, or how do you transition into exercise for a person who's taken exercise out of their program because of disease or injury or, long-term symptoms from something?
Yeah, so I always will start with something that's static. And that's really for me to gauge someone's response. Rather than throw one in the deep end and hope they swim, it's kind of like,
Yeah.
how are you going to respond if I get you to hold your breath or breathe really rapidly or breathe really slowly? And so we can kind of play with those things and say, okay, this is what happens. This is how you feel. And it also gives the person an opportunity to recognize, oh, this is transient. This is temporary. Because what I'm doing right now, it feels kind of scary and edgy, but then I stop and it goes away. Whereas if we kind of, start straight into the I'm also running or I'm also walking and this is happening, it can kind of just be a little bit too much too soon. So I always kind of start with the static side of things. And then I would almost like concurrently get them to do, something very, very simple, like can we go for a walk, nasal breathing? And so we're starting to get the feel for carbon dioxide accumulation as well, right? Natural tendency, I start exercising and I'm wanting to off-gas that really, really quickly. And that's going to make our job harder because that's going to induce kind of vasoconstriction, increase blood pressure. So can we get them just used to the feeling of CO2? Most people don't like it, but doing that in a really, really gentle way and then kind of combining those two things. And I like to do something really simple to begin with, like a walking box breath, So instead of the typical, I'm sitting down and I'm breathing in for 4 seconds, holding for 4 seconds, instead I'm walking and I'm breathing in for 4 steps, holding for 4 steps, exhaling 4 steps, holding for 4 steps. And we can start to play with the ratios of maybe extending the inhales and exhales or the holds based on that person. And then really adding in little breath holds, But again, I would always practice breath holds statically without the exercise component and see, do you have good control? Do you get a little bit worried? Like, what's your response when we take away ventilation? If I see someone tense up their shoulders, like I'm probably not going to throw them into, let's do that while you're walking because it's probably too much. But there's just a nice tapered approach of adding in respiratory components that give us more intensity without actually having to do more intensity. Which allows us to, skirt around the deconditioning component and get people into that state of like cardiac stimulus without them having to run 5Ks, or lift a lot of weight, because we're just kind of understanding the tweak that's coming from chemistry and breath control.
Absolutely. I love what you just mentioned about giving a program to a person, a breathwork program to a person in conjunction with exercise that helps to increase the intensity of the exercise without increasing the compression or the weight on the body or the speed that the body has to move at. And, like I and here in, in New York, I'm still personal training clients all day long, and 50-60% of them are considered elderly. Elderly individuals want coaches and want people to be with them, but they they want to be trained, but they like most of my elderly clients, they aren't lifting their, their one repetition maximum. They're not sprinting. They're in their 70s and their 80s. They're, they are moving, and they're working on their balance, and they're working on, and they are working on their strength, and we're lifting as much as we can. But what I found really effective for, for that person is adding in slow exhalations to increase that stimulus of the carbon dioxide and the lactate is such an interesting, not only does it increase activation of the core and help to prevent injury, but it's such an interesting way of increasing not only the feelings, but the actual intensity, of the work. And so I just think it's so interesting that you can like change the blood pH or drop the blood pH and increase lactate in the body. And by exposing your body to those chemicals, it's really interesting that the body can adapt to those chemicals that otherwise you'd have to work at a pretty darn high intensity to even create those chemicals in your body, by like moving more into like anaerobic metabolism versus aerobic. And for the listeners and viewers who don't know what that is, basically when you're working at a lower intensity of exercise, you tend to be in more of an aerobic state where you're burning more oxygen. And when you're working at a higher intensity state, you're in anaerobic metabolism. Now I'm way, way, way being general about this because there's a lot of, and this, but just to be, just to try to keep it simple. In the anaerobic place, you're burning more sugars and carbohydrates for fuel when you're lifting really heavy, when you're lifting weights, and when you're working fast and working explosively. The interesting thing about slowing the breath down is that you can increase some of those elements in the body that otherwise you would have to be working, at 85% of your maximum.
Yeah.
So I just think that's so interesting and cool. And I think a lot more research needs to be done there. And I think that, you and I are touching, like there are people in the world who are touching on this, but there's really not enough research that has been done on it. I can name a few who have, but it's not enough in my opinion.
Yeah. But it's super interesting, a few points come up as like where you went through there. And one is, it's working smarter, not harder. Mm-hmm. Really, it comes down to it with me. It's like, we can use intensity to get ourselves to a certain biochemical state, and practice being there. Or we can use intelligence and understanding of biochemistry, So I often work, like when I'm working with the ultra runner or the triathlete, if the only time they can experience, what it's going to feel like 20 miles into the run is 20 miles into the run, then that's a lot of wear and tear, right? That's a lot of reps under the belt to get that person to that state that they're going to be in during the race, And how are they going to cope, When I hit that proverbial wall, if the only time I'm there is on race day, it's like we're leaving a lot up to chance. But through breathing protocols, it's like we can put you in the kind of appropriate state through breath, right? Let's really increase CO2 in your body, change the pH. It's like, this is what it's going to feel like when you're 75% through your race. Like, so let's practice. When you get there, don't lose your form, right? Can we keep you in a nice cadence, a nice rhythm? Don't lose your breathing. Can we keep, so we get this opportunity to put someone into that really, really specific state without having to put their body through that specific state. And if someone's training for a 100-mile run, we don't want to run 50 miles all the time to get to that state. It's just going to wear the body out way too quickly.
Absolutely. I think, what I've often thought, I've asked this question so many times, every single time I think about the lactate building in the body. And I don't know if there's research out there. Maybe Xavier Warrens, who's done all of the low lung volume breath holds, with elite athletes, sprinters, bicyclists. That's the only research that I know of. And I know that he did prove that performance was improved with the long exhales and the breath holds in conjunction with sprinting and swimming and bicycling. And he did see an improvement in muscle buffering capacity. But I've often wondered, do you think, and what's your opinion on this? Do you think that, and it would make sense that we would be able to do this, by exposing yourself to more lactate at a lower intensity of exercise because you're slowing your breathing down or breath holding, could you then improve or raise your lactate threshold kind of like you would by doing, tempo runs or exposing your, marathon runners will purposefully do those lactate runs where you're finding that place where you can sustain for your tempo run, whatever that is, 10, 20 minutes and just stay at that, at that high percentage of heart rate so that you can expose yourself to lactate for that long, so that then your body is going to adapt to that. And, in theory, not only in theory, this is proven, but it doesn't work for everyone, but for most, you will then raise your lactate threshold so that then you can do more work before, the lactate starts rushing into your body. And so I've often wondered, at the lower intensity exercise, if you are exposing yourself to more lactate, is it also serving that purpose of increasing your lactate threshold,
Yeah, I have the same thoughts.
Right? And I haven't been able to answer it yet, but my gut says yes, but because you're performing a lower intensity of exercise, that's why I think research needs to be done there,
Yeah, I agree. I think in theory, the body will adapt to the conditions that we put it under, and that will be a positive adaptation because we're kind of just learning, okay, how do I metabolize energy, remove waste during this kind of biochemical environment? The only thing that I think is, maybe we would require muscle activation or muscle contraction to kind of speed that process. But that could be static contraction. I could be sitting here doing a breathing protocol and creating muscle tension, and doing isometric contractions to try and speed that process up to get us to that kind of threshold a little bit faster.
Right. No, that is such a good point. I love that. I love that thought of purposefully contracting the muscles that you want to have a better lactate or a better muscle buffering capacity. Like, if you're an endurance runner, isometrically, doing like a wall sit just with an isometric hold
exactly.
with the quads and the hamstrings and glutes, while doing the breath work. I do a lot of that.
Bring on the burn.
I totally, oh my gosh, bring on the burn. So tomorrow, this is what I'm doing with every single one of my clients. How long can you inhale 2, exhale 8, maybe like a 4-second breath hold, do that 8 times in a row. So, I like the isometric exercise, because it's just very, for the most part, very safe. And, it's, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. Oh my gosh, there was something else I was going to ask you concerning, was it lactate and endurance? It was something to do with the lactate and the carbon dioxide going up and it being, I like what you said, being local to the muscle, possibly. The other question will come back to me. Of course, I have so many other ones to ask you, but I just think I think it's really interesting, and I think we need to look deeper into this. And I guess you'd have to actually go to the exercise physiology lab and have your, we know when our lactate is rising, and we can feel when the carbon dioxide is rising, and generally the lactate is rising also with the carbon dioxide. I don't know exactly in what ratios, but it's pretty interesting. It's pretty interesting, you guys.
At least we think so.
And the people who are listening to this are also very interested in this. But yeah, I think it's really interesting, the work of the hypercapnic versus hypocapnic. Exposing the body sometimes to low carbon dioxide and sometimes high carbon dioxide during training. And I'm curious about the differences between the two. I'm not Wim Hof. I'm certified. I know of the technique, and I know that's, where your expertise lies. So I think it's interesting that there's a level of lowering carbon dioxide with the hyperventilation and then the breath holds versus a slow exhalation and then a breath hold. And I've often wondered the differences between the two in terms of, just in terms of how the autonomic nervous system responds, and then also the differences in, why maybe the body would respond positively to low carbon dioxide levels sometimes, because the body has to adapt to low and also high. I'm not as familiar with hypocapnic versus hypercapnic.
Yeah, so to me, the simplest distinction or the simplest thing that separates the two is how long is it going to allow me to hold my breath? And said another way is how hypoxic can I get, right? So for most people, if we just both held our breath now, there's a level of resting CO2 in our blood that as it begins to accumulate, my brainstem notices, says, oh, we got to breathe. Whereas if I, for example, Wim Hof method, took 30 really big breaths, I'm breathing out all of this carbon dioxide. So I'm starting from a lower number. That means more time, right? Now it's going to take a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes before my brainstem says, you got to breathe now because of the CO2 accumulation. So it allows people a much easier transition into a hypoxic state if they don't have great CO2 tolerance, which most people don't seem to unless they do, tailored practices towards that. Because for the vast majority of people, our oxygen level is not going to drop significantly inside a minute. So I need to offload that CO2, unless I'm doing exercise, obviously. But if I just stopped and hold my breath right now, it's pretty tricky for me to get to the point where my oxygen level drops because the CO2 is already climbing and I'm like, oh, I need to breathe because that CO2 is uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And so that HYPOXiX state that we go into before the breath retention just buys me time, right? That's a simple way. It's like the only part, like, and this is where you made a really perfect point as to like, we can't compartmentalize and say, oh, this is only affecting chemistry, but not the nervous system. Of course, it's always doing both. And so when I'm taking 30 deep ventilatory breaths, that's very sympathetic, right? And so now I have the nervous system response, which is pushing me up into that state of arousal. But then I have a maximum breath hold on an exhale, which is actually very parasympathetic in nature. So I get this kind of like shifting of chemistry. I'm breathing, my CO2 goes down. I'm holding, my CO2 goes up, my oxygen goes down. While I'm breathing, I'm going into a sympathetic state of autonomic arousal. When I'm holding my breath, I'm going into a parasympathetic state. And so there's this like beautiful interplay between chemistry and nervous system that I think sometimes we get a little bit too reductionist and be like, what's happening with the chemistry? And we kind of ignore everything else. Or what's going on with the nervous system? And we ignore everything else. And those two things are playing off each other as well. And so that interaction, I think, is really, really important of understanding that when I move one lever, something else is going to change down here. And I have to take that into account if I want a true understanding of like, what's this going to change?
Absolutely, and I think that's so. I think it's so important also to work both ends of the autonomic nervous system. You know, if I mean, what
Yeah.
is overtraining syndrome? Well, that's just. I mean, we don't. It's almost like we don't have any sympathetic nervous system left at all, and we are just like left in the doldrums. You know, for anyone who doesn't know what overtraining syndrome is, I mean, ultimately, our adrenals are so burnt out we cannot even produce the adrenaline, the cortisol that we need. Those are also valuable elements in our body. I mean, those things are spiking early in the morning for a reason. They're good, you know. And so sympathetic breathing or stressful breathing also has a place, kind of like high intensity sprints have a place, you know, in a person's program if they're ready for it, you know. And so I think it's so interesting the work that you do, because it seems like you do work all, you know, areas of the spectrum, which, you know, I think is so important. You know, I think to some people they think, oh, breath work is for, you know, is for meditation and it's for increasing calm. Well, some people actually need a little more of a sympathetic stimulus. Maybe they're too parasympathetically dominant, you know, and you just don't know until you get to know your, you know, your client who you're coaching. And everyone really does need something different. And probably when you're in a healthy place, you know, you really need to work, you need to work both sides, you know, just to keep, to stay balanced, maybe with, you know, a little more dominance in the parasympathetic calm, you know, kind of like I program exercise protocols, you know, just try to keep it like, you know, easy, gentle, like, you know, moderate intensity. And then like a couple times a week, you know, super high intensity, you know, to like
Go for it.
stimulate, you know, to go for it, to stimulate. That was awesome, Campbell. I know that you go. So Campbell goes and does an amazing certification, and we're so lucky that we get to chat for these, you know, these short windows. So I want to respect your time. Have an amazing time teaching and, you know, journeying into the world of educating all of these people with your, you know, your amazing wisdom. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's always fun to jump into the, you know, the little bit of a deeper aspects of it, you know, jumping into the physiology side of things. Always like, I love to geek out on that
Oh my
stuff,
God.
and I don't often get the opportunity to go as deep, so
Oh my
I really
gosh.
enjoy
No,
it.
it's really amazing. Campbell, thank you so much for everything. And just tell the listeners and viewers where they can find you and what you're up to.
So, yeah, I'm most active on Instagram, but on all social media handles at Breathbodytherapy. I teach certification for health practitioners. I also have a 5-week kind of self-paced course, but if anyone's interested in diving in a little bit deeper to their breath, reach out.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, thank you, Campbell, for joining me today. I'm AJ of HYPOXiX.fitness. Please join me for classes that teach you breathography, a breathing methodology used with exercise to prevent injury and enhance all systems. Please keep on achieving inner altitude. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Campbell.
Thanks, AJ.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.